Today I'd like to talk about Exodus chapter 21 as we continue our journey through the book of Exodus. Amazing book. Chapter 21 is different in the sense that it's not so much about the story of the people as it is about some of the rules that they shaped to help them be a cohesive society. And some of those rules a little bit different than rules that we would have today. So it's interesting to take a look at them and maybe compare them with where we are today. The first rule said that a Hebrew slave will serve for 6 years. And in the 7th year, the slave will be freed without any cost. So they serve for 6 years, then they're freed. So there's a way to achieve liberation. If the slave has a wife, she will be freed with him. So the wife goes with the slave, which is a good thing. If the master gave him the wife and they had children, the wife and the children will stay with the master, and the man would leave by himself. So in that case, there is a little family separation that's going on because the master had given him the wife. And sometimes in many cultures, that would be so that they could have children, and the children could work the land, there would be more slaves, it would keep the slave pipeline kind of going. And so that would be a real issue that we would have with it in terms of families and family separation. But if the slave wants to stay a slave, to be with his wife and children, the slave has the option of renouncing his freedom and becoming a slave forever. So in many cases, if the slave was treated well, if things were going okay, and the slave wanted to stay with the wife and the children, which in most cases, if the marriage was good, I'm sure, and relationships with the children, they would want to do that. They would have that choice of being a slave forever, not achieving their freedom. And in some cases, that would work out to be a good thing if it was a good arrangement for everyone in that particular family situation. The slave is brought to God, and his ear is pierced as a sign of obedience to his master. So that particular slave, the piercing of the ear was always a sign of, well, I am obedient to that master. I am part of that particular family. When a man sells his daughter for a slave, she shall not go free, as male slaves do. So again, that discrimination you see in the culture between the male and the female. If a master who wanted to take her for his wife doesn't like her, he can let her be redeemed. So she would have that option as well. So the master said, she's going to be my wife. If this doesn't work out, then she can be redeemed by somebody else. He cannot sell her, however, to a foreigner. So it has to be somebody within the clan, within the area, somebody who is known. If he gives her to his son, he will treat her as his daughter. So again, there would be that special family relationship. She would be like one of his daughters and have that kind of family connection. If he takes another wife, he has to give her food, clothing, and conjugal rights. So he might have a second wife or a third wife or a fourth wife. In some cases, there were many wives. Still, the other wives would have to have equal rights in terms of food, clothing, and conjugal rights. If he does not give her all these things, she should be given her freedom without any cost to her. So again, he wasn't giving her what he should have been given her by law, by custom, and so she was entitled to a freedom. But again, in a lot of these cultures, you would have your freedom, but what would you do with that freedom? Where would you go? Would you go to another master? It was difficult. There weren't a lot of professions sometimes that the woman could enter into. So there were a lot of limitations within that particular society. If someone strikes a man a mortal blow, he must be put to death. The executioner would usually be the closest blood relative in that case. Be called the goal or the avenger of blood. A harder punishment than other Near East codes because of the emphasis on the sacredness of life. So the idea was that life was so sacred, and if there was this interruption of life, if there was this death that would happen, if there was this mortal injury, there should be a punishment. And that was because life was precious and sacred, and so there had to be some sort of consequence if somebody took a life. If the death was caused by an act of God, say an accident happened, he can go to a place that will be set aside. So the death wasn't really caused directly by him or her, and so there would be another alternative, a safe place for them. If a man were to kill someone maliciously, he can be taken even from the altar and put to death. So they might be at the altar offering sacrifice, but they killed somebody maliciously. That didn't stand in the way of the punishment. If someone strikes his father or mother, he should be put to death. So again, that great respect for father and mother. Even if you strike them, not necessarily putting them to death, but you strike them, you should be put to death for that, because there's tremendous respect in the society for the mother and father. As we saw in chapter 20, one of the commandments to honor your mother and your father. A kidnapper shall be put to death, whether he sells his victim or has him with him when he is caught. But kidnapping, not tolerated, the person would be put to death. As you can see, there's somewhat very harsh punishments with these laws. It'd be an example of the casuistic type of law that we talked about in chapter 20. And in that law, there's if you do something wrong, these are the consequences. Some of these consequences were rather harsh, but the idea was to set a atmosphere in the culture so that these things would not be done. That's the idea of the harshness of the punishment. If there is a quarrel and one man strikes another with his fist or with a stone, and he does not die, but he has to recover in bed, the one who struck the blow should be acquitted. But he must help the person with his cure and compensate him for his inability to work. So the person is out of work, they can't work and do what they normally could, so there must be some compensation, some monetary compensation to help them through their difficult time. This only applies if he can walk around with his staff. So if he's able to walk around, if he's able to get out of bed a little bit, but he can't do his normal job, then there would be some compensation for them, and you would be obligated to help that person. If a man strikes his slave and the slave dies, he is to be punished. If the slave survives for a day or two, there is no punishment because the slave is his property. So if the slave dies, that's one thing, but if they are okay after a couple of days, then there is no punishment at all, because the slave was seen as a piece of property, which again is something that we encountered in our own culture with slavery in America, how the problem was that that person was sold as a piece of property. You actually owned that person. When men have a fight and hurt a pregnant woman so that she has a miscarriage but no further injury, the man will be fined as much as the woman's husband demands of him. So he has to pay a fine because the woman is okay, but the baby is, of course, deceased through the miscarriage. He will pay in the presence of judges. So there would be judges who would be designated who would oversee this whole process. You see, there were very poor conditions for women at this time. Unfortunately, many women would turn to prostitution as a way out of this, as a way of trying to make a living for themselves. What other options were open to them? Very few, very limited, and so it was very difficult. Some women, of course, if the husband were to die and leave them with money, some widows, it could be a different situation. But for most women, very difficult situation for them. And of course, still in many parts of the world, that is true. If there is injury, you will give a life for a life, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound, a stripe for a stripe. It was called the lex talionis, basically tit for tat. What you do to me, I can do back to you. And basically, this was kind of meant to prevent a greater harm from being done. So if somebody were to cut off your hand, you couldn't gouge out their eyes and do all sorts of other things. It was limited what the punishment could be. And that, of course, is always the difficulty with any legal system in terms of setting up a punishment. How far should you go for the punishment? Are you aiming at rehabilitation? Do you want that person to return to the community? All of these, of course, difficult issues to work out. And we would see an eye for an eye and hand for hand as maybe cruel, excessively cruel. But the original intent was actually the opposite, was to rein in any excessive cruelties. Uh, if a man strikes a slave in the eye and he destroys the use of the eye, the slave can go free as compensation for the eye. So that was, again, was a liberation of the slave in that situation. But again, where would the slave go? What would the slave do? Would they have to go into another relationship with another master? What options were open for the slave? Sometimes the slave having very little financial resources to have another decent option. Uh, if he knocks out a tooth, also the slave can go free. Now, when an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox must be stoned and the flesh cannot be eaten. The owner of the ox is not punished, but the ox is kind of taken care of. If, however, the ox had gored previously and the owner was warned and he did not keep the ox in, both the ox and the owner would be killed if that ox killed anyone. So the owner had been kind of warned. It had happened before. They should have really fenced the ox in some way so the ox didn't hurt anybody else. An alternative could be the paying of a fine as a ransom for his life. So instead of taking my life, I can pay you X amount of dollars to your family as compensation. And if the family accepted that, that would be a good arrangement. If it is a slave that is killed by the ox, the fine is 30 shekels of silver, and the ox must be stoned. So again, it would be a monetary thing. And even in the other case, where the ox killed someone who was not a slave, someone who was a master, who was the head of a family, that person could give a certain amount of money and get their freedom and not be killed in that situation. Now, if a man digs a cistern and does not cover it, and an animal falls in and dies, the owner of the cistern must make good by restoring the value of the animal to its owner. He can keep the dead animal, however, but he must restore the money that because he would have been responsible for covering over the cistern so that nobody fell in, particularly the animals. Again, this was be a sense that these animals were very valuable, and so this was to protect the economic interests. Um, when a man's ox hurts another man's ox, and that ox dies, they will sell the ox and divide this money as well as the dead ox equally between the two. So again, there'd be a fairness. The money would be divided, the ox would be divided, and so there would be a sense of equality there in terms of the punishment. If the ox was in the habit of goring previously and the owner didn't keep it in, the owner of that ox must make a full restitution and the other owner will keep his dead ox. So he was warned, it had happened before. Again, he didn't restrain the ox, so the full responsibility of the judgment falls on this particular person, and they must pay the compensation for the ox, and the other person keeps the dead ox, which again would have been used for food, so very valuable. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters or sells it, he shall restore 5 oxen for the one ox and 4 sheep for the one sheep. So the sense was you stole that, you slaughtered it, you sold it, you must pay a greater compensation. So we can see in all of these elements here in chapter 21 a sense of trying to establish fairness. And of course, who was the first one in our scriptures who tried to establish fairness in his community, fairness among his people, fairness among his tribe? It was, of course, our own beloved father Abraham. And as we know, Father Abraham has many friends. Many friends has Father Abraham. I am one of them, and so are you. So let's all praise the Lord. Keep on praising the Lord, and God bless.